Today, the United States possesses one of the most powerful militaries, largest economies, and most influential cultures on Earth. But here is the strange part. A little more than 2 centuries ago, this country did not exist. There was no Washington, D.C., no United States president, no stars and stripes flying over 50 states. And long before Europeans began building colonies here, millions of indigenous people lived across the Americas in diverse societies with their own governments, economies, alliances, rivalries, and traditions. So how did a collection of settlements on the Atlantic coast transform into a continental republic, survive a civil war that nearly destroyed it, become an industrial giant, help determine the outcome of 2 world wars, fight a 40-year global struggle against the Soviet Union, and eventually emerge as perhaps the most powerful country of the modern age? And there is an even harder question. Was America's rise mainly a story of liberty and opportunity, or conquest, conflict, and contradiction? Because almost every chapter of American history contains both: freedom and slavery, democracy and exclusion, opportunity and dispossession, extraordinary innovation and extraordinary violence. And less than a century after declaring that human beings possessed equal rights, Americans would be killing Americans on an unimaginable scale. But to understand why, we have to begin before there was an America at all. Indigenous America, European colonization, and the 13 colonies. Forget the old image of an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. Long before sustained European colonization, indigenous peoples inhabited environments stretching from the Arctic to the southern Americas. Different nations developed political institutions, diplomatic relationships, trade networks, and ways of managing the land adapted to their particular environments. Native peoples are not merely figures from America's past. Native nations and cultures continue today. Then came one of the most disruptive encounters in human history. European expansion brought explorers, merchants, missionaries, settlers, and diseases against which indigenous communities had little immunity. Warfare, epidemic disease, forced displacement, and colonial expansion devastated many native societies. And here is our first question. When 2 completely different worlds collide, who actually changes whom? Because Europeans transformed America, but America would also transform Europe. New crops, resources, lands, and commercial opportunities became part of a growing Atlantic economy. Spain established territories across large parts of the Americas. France developed its own North American presence. The Dutch became active around what would eventually become New York, and the English began constructing permanent colonies along the Atlantic coast. Jamestown was founded in Virginia in 1607. Plymouth followed in 1620, while further colonial ventures expanded during the 17th century. But these colonies were not identical. New England developed differently from Virginia. Plantation agriculture became enormously important in the South. Port cities grew, religious communities arrived, merchants crossed the Atlantic, and increasingly, enslaved Africans were forced into an economic system that would become central to the development of British North America. This is one of the great contradictions at the foundation of what became the United States. Ideas about political liberty grew alongside a system in which millions would ultimately be denied liberty entirely. By the 18th century, Britain controlled 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, and for a surprisingly long time, many colonists did not seriously imagine separating from Britain. Even by the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, the coming revolution was far from inevitable. But that war changed everything. Britain had fought an expensive global conflict. London increasingly expected its American colonies to contribute to imperial expenses. New taxes and regulations followed. Colonists protested. Britain responded. The colonists resisted again. And what began as arguments about taxation and parliamentary authority gradually became something much bigger. Mass protests, political organizations, violence, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, British retaliation, and eventually armed confrontation. Imagine being alive in 1775. Your neighbors are talking about rebellion against one of the most powerful empires on earth. Failure might not simply mean losing an election. It could mean imprisonment, confiscation, or death. So ask yourself, would you have joined the revolution? Because the people who did were about to gamble everything, and their rebellion would create a country whose founding promise would haunt it for the next 200 years. Independence, Washington, and the birth of the Republic War had already begun when representatives of the colonies gathered in Philadelphia. Then, in 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Its importance went beyond announcing separation from Britain. It articulated principles that became central to American political identity: government deriving legitimacy from the people, and the idea that fundamental rights existed beyond the arbitrary will of rulers. Powerful words. But there was an enormous problem. The society proclaiming liberty still included slavery. Native nations were outside the political community being imagined. Women possessed few formal political rights. America's founding ideals were therefore not a description of reality. They were closer to a promise. And generations of Americans would later ask, who exactly was included in that promise? The war against Britain lasted years. George Washington's Continental Army experienced shortages, defeats, and moments when the revolutionary cause appeared dangerously close to collapse. But the rebellion survived. French assistance became crucial. And in 1783, Britain formally recognized American independence. The revolution had succeeded. Creating a functional country was another matter entirely. The first national framework, the Articles of Confederation, produced a government deliberately limited in power. The Articles served as the country's first constitution until the current constitutional system came into effect in 1789. The young republic faced debts, disputes between states, questions over trade, foreign policy problems, and a fundamental argument: how powerful should the central government be? In Philadelphia in 1787, delegates designed a new constitution, a presidency, Congress, federal courts, checks and balances, federalism. The Constitution created a stronger government while attempting to prevent any single branch from becoming dominant. Yet compromise again came with contradiction. The new political order protected Republican government while accommodating slavery. America had survived its revolution without resolving one of the issues that would eventually tear it apart. George Washington became the first president in 1789. His administration established precedents that later presidents would follow. Political parties began taking shape despite widespread suspicion of factionalism. Arguments emerged over banking, taxation, relations with Britain and France, and how literally the Constitution should be interpreted. America had become independent. Now Americans had to decide what America actually was. Then the country began expanding. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 dramatically enlarged the territory claimed by the United States. Expansion promised land, agriculture, resources, and opportunity. But there was another side. The West was not empty. Native nations lived there. And as American settlement moved westward, pressure on indigenous lands intensified. The new nation also fought Britain again in the War of 1812. The United States survived. A stronger sense of national identity developed. Yet beneath that confidence, another problem was becoming impossible to ignore. Every new territory raised a dangerous political question. Would slavery expand with America? Because the young republic was growing incredibly fast, And its greatest success, continental expansion, was helping create the crisis that might destroy it. Expansion, slavery, civil war, and Reconstruction. During the 19th century, Americans pushed increasingly westward. Some saw expansion as progress. New farms, new towns, new markets, new railways, new opportunities. But from another perspective, the same expansion meant broken treaties, removal, and loss of traditional lands for native peoples. The National Park Service notes that federal expansion policies repeatedly displaced native communities and restricted access to lands, food sources, and cultural practices. One of the darkest examples was Indian removal. Native peoples, including Cherokee communities in the Southeast, were forced westward as white settlement expanded. At the same time, slavery became more deeply embedded in the cotton economy of the South, and the larger America became, the harder one question became to avoid. Would new Western territories permit slavery? Congress tried compromises, again and again. But compromise was becoming temporary anesthesia for a political wound that kept growing. The United States also fought Mexico from 1846 to 1848, after which American territory extended across huge areas of what is now the western and southwestern United States. More territory, more opportunity, and yet again, more arguments over slavery. By the 1850s, politics had become explosive. The Library of Congress describes growing conflict between North and South over slavery as a central force undermining the political climate of the period. Then Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election of 1860. Southern states began leaving the Union. They formed the Confederate States of America. And in April 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter. The American Civil War had begun. Think about this for a moment. The country founded after defeating Britain was only about 85 years old, and now Americans were fighting Americans. Families divided. Cities became military targets. Entire regions mobilized. Industrial capacity, railroads, and manpower became weapons. At first, preserving the Union was the federal government's central war objective, but slavery increasingly moved to the center of the conflict. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation declared enslaved people in areas still in rebellion to be free and transformed the war's relationship to slavery. African American soldiers joined the Union war effort. The fighting continued. Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Sherman's campaigns, Petersburg, enormous casualties. Finally, in 1865, Confederate resistance collapsed. The Union survived. Slavery was abolished nationally through the 13th Amendment. But victory created a new question. How do you rebuild a country after its citizens have spent 4 years killing one another? That period became known as Reconstruction. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments fundamentally changed the Constitution. Formerly enslaved African Americans entered political life, voted, held office, and built institutions during Reconstruction. For a moment, a radically different South appeared possible. But resistance was fierce. Southern governments enacted black codes, restricting the freedom of formerly enslaved people. White supremacist violence increased. Eventually, Reconstruction weakened, and systems of racial segregation and political disenfranchisement became entrenched across much of the South. The Civil War had abolished slavery. It had not produced racial equality. And while America struggled with the aftermath of war, another revolution was already underway. Not political, industrial. Railroads were stretching across the continent. Factories were multiplying. Cities were exploding. Millions of immigrants were arriving. America was about to become extraordinarily wealthy. And that wealth would eventually turn a former colony into a global power. Industry, immigration, depression, and 2 world wars. After the Civil War, The United States transformed at extraordinary speed. Railroads connected distant regions. Steel production expanded. Oil became a major industry. Factories grew. Corporations became enormous. Cities swelled with workers. The Library of Congress describes this period as one in which industrialization created powerful industrial elites, a growing middle class, and a vastly expanded working class, fueled heavily by immigration and migration from rural areas. Men like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller became symbols of staggering private wealth. To admirers, they represented innovation and enterprise. To critics, they represented dangerous concentrations of economic power. And ordinary workers often faced long hours, dangerous conditions, and little security. So here's the question. When a country becomes richer, does that automatically mean its people become better off? American history repeatedly shows that the answer is complicated. Millions of immigrants arrived searching for opportunity. American cities became more ethnically and culturally diverse. Meanwhile, settlement of the West accelerated after the Civil War. Railroads opened enormous areas to economic development and migration, but the process also intensified the dispossession of native peoples. By the end of the 19th century, the United States was no longer merely a growing continental republic. It was becoming an international power. And then Europe went to war. World War I began in 1914. For years, America remained formally outside the conflict. But in 1917, the United States entered the war. American soldiers, industry, and financial power helped strengthen the Allied war effort. The war ended the following year. America had demonstrated that events across the Atlantic could no longer be separated from American power. Back home, American society continued changing. Women had fought for voting rights for generations, and the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, constitutionally prohibiting denial of voting rights based on sex, although racial discrimination still prevented many women from exercising those rights equally. The Progressive Era also brought battles over labor conditions, political corruption, conservation, and the regulation of powerful corporations. Then came the 1920s. Cars, radio, consumer culture, stock speculation, jazz, skyscrapers, mass entertainment. America appeared unstoppable, until it wasn't. In 1929, the economic boom collapsed into the Great Depression. Banks failed, businesses disappeared, unemployment surged, families lost savings and homes. The crisis shattered confidence in the economic system. Franklin D. Roosevelt entered the presidency in 1933 and launched the New Deal, expanding federal involvement in economic relief, employment programs, and regulation. But the Depression did not simply vanish. Economic hardship persisted through the 1930s, and wartime production would ultimately drive enormous economic mobilization. Because while Americans were fighting unemployment at home, dictatorships were expanding abroad. Germany under Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. World War II began in Europe. Initially, the United States remained outside the direct fighting. Then came December 7, 1941. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II. The transformation was enormous. Factories shifted to military production. Millions entered the armed forces. Women filled jobs previously dominated by men. The United States fought Germany and Italy in Europe, and Japan across the Pacific. Yet even during a war presented as a fight against tyranny, the American government incarcerated Japanese Americans. Another reminder that national ideals and national actions did not always align. By 1945, Nazi Germany had been defeated. Japan surrendered later that year. The war was over. Much of Europe and Asia had been devastated, but the United States emerged with enormous industrial, military, and economic power. The U.S. State Department's Historical Office describes America after World War II as one of the world's foremost economic, political, and military powers. The old European-centered international order had been transformed, and now two giants stood above the ruins: the United States and the Soviet Union. They had just fought on the same side. They were about to become enemies, and this time the weapons included nuclear bombs capable of destroying entire cities. Cold War, civil rights, 9/11, and modern America. After 1945, the United States faced a completely different world. Washington increasingly viewed Soviet expansion as the central geopolitical threat. American strategist George Kennan helped formulate the policy known as containment, limiting the further expansion of Soviet influence. It became a fundamental element of American Cold War strategy. The United States supported European recovery, helped create NATO, maintained troops overseas, built nuclear weapons, fought in Korea, competed with the Soviet Union across politics, intelligence, technology, ideology, and military power. The two superpowers rarely fought each other directly. That was precisely what made the Cold War so frightening. A direct conflict might become nuclear, but while America promoted freedom against communism abroad, millions of Black Americans were still living under segregation at home, and that contradiction became increasingly difficult to defend. In 1954, the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education ruled racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. Activists organized boycotts, sit-ins, freedom rides, mass marches, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, students, churches, local organizers whose names never became famous. People were arrested, beaten, threatened. Some were murdered. Yet the movement continued. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation in many public accommodations and prohibited important forms of employment discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 attacked discriminatory voting practices, such as literacy tests, used in parts of the South. America was again being forced to confront the same question first, embedded in its founding. Who is actually entitled to the rights America claims to represent? And that struggle did not end in the 1960s. Meanwhile, the Cold War continued. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the superpowers terrifyingly close to nuclear confrontation. America became deeply involved in Vietnam. The war divided American society and produced enormous controversy at home. The United States eventually withdrew its combat forces, while the war ended with North Vietnam's victory in 1975. Yet this same era produced one of the greatest technological achievements in human history. In 1969, American astronauts landed on the moon. Think about the scale of the transformation. A country that had begun as 13 colonies using muskets and sailing ships had placed human beings on another world in less than 2 centuries. Then, in the late 1980s, Soviet power began unraveling. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. The Cold War was over. For a brief period, it appeared that the United States had entered an era of unmatched global dominance, but history had not stopped. September 11, 2001. 19 al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 passenger aircraft. 2 struck the World Trade Center. 1 hit the Pentagon. Another crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers and crew resisted the hijackers. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The official 9/11 memorial records 2,977 deaths in the attacks. The attacks transformed American foreign and domestic policy. The United States invaded Afghanistan in October 2001 as part of what became the global war on terror, and later invaded Iraq. For another generation, wars in the Middle East and Central Asia became part of America's story. Then came another shock. The financial crisis of 2008 triggered a severe economic downturn. That same year, Barack Obama was elected president, becoming the first African American to hold the office. an extraordinary milestone in a country whose history had been so deeply shaped by slavery and racial exclusion. The Smithsonian's historical timeline records both Obama's election and 9/11 among major events in modern American history. Technology was changing America too. The internet, smartphones, social media, artificial intelligence. New industries created enormous fortunes, while also transforming how Americans worked, communicated, consumed information, and participated in politics. Then in 2020, another crisis arrived. COVID-19 spread across the United States, producing a major public health emergency and radically disrupting ordinary life. And this brings us to America today, a country capable of extraordinary scientific innovation, a global military power, a center of technology, finance, entertainment, and higher education, but also a society still arguing intensely about race, immigration, inequality, political power, the role of government, and America's place in the world. And perhaps that is why American history is so difficult to summarize. It's an argument over the meaning of freedom, over who belongs, over how much power government should possess, over whether economic success creates genuine equality, over whether American power abroad lives up to American principles at home. Those arguments existed in 1776. They survived the Civil War. They survived industrialization, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Cold War, Vietnam, 9/11, and they continue today. So, how did 13 colonies become one of the most powerful countries in history? There was no single reason. Geography mattered, resources mattered, immigration mattered, industry mattered, military power mattered, political institutions mattered. So did conquest, slavery, war, scientific innovation, and millions of ordinary people whose names never entered history books. America's greatest strength may also explain many of its greatest conflicts. It created enormous ideals, and then repeatedly struggled over who was entitled to them. That is why the history of the United States is not simply the story of presidents, wars, and borders. It is the story of people continuously arguing over what the words American freedom are supposed to mean. And maybe the most interesting chapter is the one being written right now. So here's the question I want to leave with you. When historians look back at America 100 years from today, what do you think they will say defined our era? American decline, American reinvention, or the beginning of something completely different?